I would like to talk about the creative destruction of institutions. And creative destruction is something that Joseph Schumpeter, he's an economist from, say, the 1930s and 1940s, he came up with this notion. And I'll talk a little bit more about what it means in a second. But basically, it's where the focus and the energy is not on the thing that's being destroyed. The focus is on the things that are getting bigger and expanding, the things that are perhaps determined to be better within a system. That's where the focus is, and as a result of the expansion of those things, something else is getting destroyed. Now, what do I mean by institutions here? And the definition I like to work with is institutions are rules, roles for people, norms, and enforcement mechanisms that make up some system. So institutions, of course, include things like firms and corporations. They include regulatory bodies. They include academic institutions, journalistic institutions. But they also include things that are a little bit more broad. For example, marriage is an institution. Slavery was an institution that definitely needed to be destroyed. You have social institutions in terms of the social norms that determine what things get judged harshly and what things get accolades in society. That's institutions. So it's really broad. And I'm going to stick with the ones that are kind of easy to think about and easy to visualize, like firms, corporations, regulatory bodies, for this video at least. But I do think the same process is going to hold for other types of institutions. So how does creative destruction fit in with the project of this channel? Because, of course, we live in this moment that is a potential change point in history. And there are some similarities with the old Enlightenment in terms of the need to get out from under the thumb of existing power structures. And with that in mind, this channel really is about paradigm shifts in economics, governance, and knowledge systems. So which of those three things does creative destruction fall most under? And it might be tempting to put it under the umbrella of economics. And that's, of course, because he's an economist. If you hear creative destruction being discussed in academia, it is way more likely to be in an econ department than other places. But in a lot of ways, the whole point I'm making in this video is that it should not just be economics. That should not be the only realm where this phenomenon is at play. Like, it should belong really under all three. Governance systems and knowledge systems, I think, could benefit from creative destruction, just like economic systems can as well. Now, in this book, when he introduces creative destruction, he's talking about capitalism, socialism, and democracy. And ultimately, he does not think capitalism will survive in the very, very long run. And yet, he's also sort of making a case for capitalism against Marxism. And there's lots I agree with, lots I don't agree with in the book, just like with any other thinker. But what he's best known for here is the concept of creative destruction. So let me read you a couple of quotes on that topic. The essential point to grasp is that in dealing with capitalism, we are dealing with an evolutionary process. Industrial mutation, if I may use that biological term, that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating the new one. So creative destruction is embedded inside this evolutionary process, where he's thinking of firms as having like DNA that may survive, it may serve well within the system, or it may die out. Now, of course, if you're thinking about an evolutionary system, you do have to ask the question, what is the mechanism that determines whether something grows, whether it shrinks and dies out? And that mechanism is sort of what I'm kind of focused on in terms of I think there needs to be some changes in our system in terms of what determines what grows and what shrinks. And there's going to be a bunch of options for that. I mean, voting with your feet, voting with your dollars, voting with your time, voting with your vote, voting with your budgeted votes. Like, there's all kinds of mechanisms that could be used for that. And I do think the digital environment is going to make way for more creative mechanisms for determining that. But I also think it's worthwhile for us to think about sort of the small business ecosystem and the way that plays out when it comes to creative destruction. So let's imagine an ecosystem of small businesses, and the DNA of those businesses is going to be the rules within the business, the social relationships, and the unspoken rules between people who are operating that business, the hierarchy or lack of hierarchy in terms of the way it's designed by the startup owners or the founders of that business. And we're imagining an ecosystem with lots of these, and we might imagine them all starting out as the same size of business. What will determine what grows and what shrinks, and shrinkage, of course, in this context is creative destruction. The rules that determine that in, say, a capitalist system are $1, one vote. And I think one way people think about this that I think is incomplete and poignantly incomplete in the current situation is that people will imagine that the $1, one vote gives rich people a ton of power, like a ton of voting power in terms of which of these small businesses grows and which shrinks, and that poor people don't have as much power to sort of influence what succeeds in the system. And there's a lot of energy regarding should rich people have as much power as they do in determining that, or should it be more equal? Which, that's definitely an important question. But I think the situation we're in now is not rich people versus poor people. Rather, it's going to be institutions, like organizational institutions, versus rich people. And one way of thinking about this is if we imagine, say, a one-party country, where you essentially have a dictator at the top and like a very strong hierarchy leading up to the central group who's in charge of that one party. And if that one party had what looked a little bit like a capitalist system, except the one party government could come in and put their thumb on the scale in a way that majorly determined which organizations got to grow and which organizations got to shrink, I think that would be, in many ways, against what many people who are in support of capitalism would be against. And if you have, say, a corporate ecosystem where the institutions of the corporate ecosystem and the people who are at the top of whatever that hierarchy is, if they have goals of their own that is not just looking at the population and attuning to the needs of the rich or attuning to the needs of the population, if they have goals of their own and can put their thumb on the scale in terms of which small businesses grow into huge corporations, which shrink, what rules they're trying to enforce on this ecosystem, that would be, in many ways, not what I think a lot of capitalists would want. But this video is not about capitalism and socialism, despite the title of his book. This video is about the question, could the same sort of mechanism where you have an ecosystem and some set of rules determining what organizations grow and what organizations shrink, and when an organization stops serving ideally its social purpose, that could be displaced by other institutions growing larger and crowding it out. The question is, could that happen for institutions that are not currently in that setup? Like regulatory bodies that might, say, get in bed with industries that they're regulating or that might do other things. Could those regulatory bodies be subject to some kind of evolutionary system where if that regulatory body is too cozy with the industry it's regulating, actually there's other startup regulatory bodies that are better set up to actually do the regulation? And I think the answer is yes. I think this is the kind of thinking we're going to need to revitalize our system and to build an immune system into it. And so I just think it's a super useful idea, especially when designing systems.